LPD 1041.
Signalton Assistance.
Inside the Squad, presented by the Lafayette Police Department. To serve and protect is not just a motto, it's our mission.
Sending another unit.
Step it up.
All right, so welcome back to Inside the Squad, and I am here today with this very special guest in our line of work, Dr. Dardeen, and we also have our chief, Scott Galloway here, and then of course myself, Sergeant Sean Verma, and MK running everything for us in the background here. So, so real quick, I'm gonna go ahead and welcome Dr. Dardeen. So Dr. Dardeen, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us where you work, what you do, and how you got into this line of work.
Sure. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm the owner of Suncrest Psychological Services. So about 8 years ago or so, we started a private practice that has now grown to 4 full-time therapists. And our primary goal is we support first responder agencies. So we have private contracts with about 27, I think now, organizations where we provide some level of clinical support, whether that is just an EAP program where folks can come in on their own if they are wanting treatment or a specific after incident support, things like that. Or for some agencies, we also do pre-employment testing. So we see the candidate as they're starting their career. For others, we also do some regular training, just to wellness focused topics, things like that. And then for most of our agencies, we provide some level of critical incident support after things that happen that are going to be disruptive to unit cohesion and things like that to first responders in general. So that's been about 8 years in developing, started with one agency and now has just expanded to several in this community and the surrounding counties and things like that. So that's kind of how it looks now. How we got started is actually kind of by accident, to be honest. I was a first responder 25 plus years ago now in EMS, and then married a first responder. My husband was a paramedic for 25 years. My father's a volunteer firefighter. My brother's at IMPD. So that's kind of something that's been present in our family. But it actually started working with first responders when I was finishing my residency in Salt Lake City. So I was working for one of the big hospital systems out west and ended up working with some SWAT team members that had had a helicopter crash. And so about a year after their crash, several of them started having symptoms, and that escalated to what we see primarily, which is behavioral difficulties at work. So several of them were in disciplinary status for, one of them had punched a coworker, things like that they weren't showing up, they were having more absences, things like that. And that got escalated up to, hey, we think there's a mental health component. So they had brought several of them in on a random Friday afternoon. They were not thrilled to be there. That was not their goal. That was not what they wanted to be doing on their Friday afternoon. But we sat down and started going through some of the things that had happened, and it turned into, I think, a pretty good working relationship. And then I had moved back to Indiana shortly after that and ended up doing a similar concept with one of our city employees here in Lafayette, where I had worked with a firefighter after a critical incident, and he took that back to some of the city folks and said, hey, this was helpful. We would like to have this in place, and things kind of grew from there.
Very nice. So one of your specialties is obviously trauma, and especially for first responders. So obviously anyone in our community can be a victim of some kind of a trauma.
Yeah.
Any traumatic, anybody can be that. But due to statistics and data, our line of work, whether it be EMS, firefighters, police officers, we're definitely experiencing way more trauma than majority of just the average citizen in town.
Yeah.
With that being said, I think that's the most important thing for us is how do we deal with that trauma? Where do we go? And I think the chief can probably hone in a little bit on this. Is the chief's been around a lot longer than I have, so it wasn't very common, right, Chief, to talk about these things openly. And now here we are having a podcast, and our guest is Dr. Dardeen, and we're talking about our mental health. So, like, going back in the day, like, how did you and your coworkers, when you were a brand new officer, deal with mental health, or did you even know that you were experiencing something that was a mental health trauma?
Yeah, boy, how times have changed. So thank you, Dr. Dardeen, for being here and for what you do for our police department. And Sean's right that it was, you kept everything inside. You didn't show any emotion. You never talked about those things because if you did, then you were weak. I mean, we all know those type of scenarios. So I think I was a captain, and we started working together. I really enjoyed that. But it's hard to make that leap from when I started 27 years ago, and there was nothing like this. We didn't have an EAP, even for the city, we didn't have an EAP provider. So to have this now is incredible. And it's the stigma, I think, is diminishing, if not significantly down, as officers now feel comfortable going to seek services, and they can do that privately, which is critical that our officers are doing that. Because you're right, I don't know the stats, I think it's officers see trauma at a rate of 800 to 1 or 2 of the normal population, however you can describe that scenario. But yeah, so we're lucky to have Dr. Dardeen, and we're lucky that our department embraces this type of service because it's critical for officers. This is a grueling job. It's never going to get easier, so we're glad to have it, and you do a fantastic job for our guys, or our women, our officers.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And it's something I didn't anticipate doing, but it's been an enjoyable challenge for all of those reasons, right? Because we have the older folks that are in management roles now, right, that have been there longer, that got a much different philosophy, pushed at them when they started, and lots different things to think about. Now we're having to completely reverse that and retrain folks and come at it from a different angle. We're always fighting the stigma, but I can say, just in 8 years, it's gotten a lot better. It's easier to talk about that. It's easier to recognize that, yes, you're a police officer or a firefighter or an EMS person, and you're trained with this very extensive skill set, but you're still a human being. And the reality is, if you're a human being, there are things that are going to happen and things that you're going to experience that you can't shut off, nor do we want them to. So instead of trying to separate that, which I think has been the traditional, right? Compartmentalize, don't feel that, push that down. That's a skill now that we can say, absolutely use that when you're on scene, but that's the only space where that's okay to do. And after that, that's when we have to talk about it, get it out of your mind, like give you skills to combat the things that happen when you see those things so that you can go on to live a productive life and not sacrifice your happiness, your family, your marriage, all of those things.
What about 8 years ago when you started Suncrest? Was there still a huge stigma 8 years ago?
Yes. It was rough. And it was just me at the time. I didn't have, anybody else, no staff, no anything like that. And so, yeah, there were some days that, I probably left work saying, well, I'm going to do something else. The attitudes were very frustrating sometimes, especially when you see people in pain and you know that they don't have to be that way. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the hard part. It's like, we're making it harder than it needs to be. Just like, when somebody comes in and they're a new officer and they're going through training, or even they're seasoned officers, they don't take it at face value that they qualify for their weapons. They don't let somebody come in and say, yeah, no, I got this skill and I'm good to go. They put a system in place to prove that they are proficient in that. But when it comes to mental health, it's just, are you good? Yep, we're good. And we accept that. And that's not helpful, because the reality is, when we take care of our employees, when we put mental health at the forefront, when we weave that into policies and training and things regularly, they learn it's worthwhile to take care of themselves. And they learn that there's an expectation that they take care of themselves. Just like we wouldn't let them run around without any of these other physical skills, this is just as much a part of their job.
So it's been very recent that the tides and attitudes have shifted.
I would say specifically within the last 2 to 3 years, it has gotten better. It has been years and years of what sometimes feels like, bashing your head against a solid wall to make progress and to encourage folks to use something regularly. And unfortunately, it usually takes the form of waiting till something really bad happens. And then when there's that opportunity for growth, we come back and start services with a lot of agencies in that when they're in really severe need, which is not my favorite, but it is what it is. That's when they're willing to engage, and then hopefully growing out from there.
So mental health is very important to everyone, not just first responders, but let's talk about why it's especially important to first responders. Like, what do you guys go through in comparison to an average person? Like, let's talk about the trauma and why.
Yeah, I mean, like we said earlier, mental health and trauma, anyone can experience trauma, right? We all see something. And I think as police officers, and Chief can relate, we see so much that sometimes something that a regular civilian may find traumatic, we're completely just used to it because we're just almost developed that way.
Right.
But I think what it comes down to, and Dr. Dardeen, you kind of hit it on point, was taking care of our employees and taking care of ourselves. That's where mental health really comes down. I don't think the community can trust us doing our job if we don't first put ourselves up front and take care of ourselves. And finding that line is so important. And every officer is different. What you experience, what you don't experience, every single officer is going to have different levels. And Dr. Dardeen could probably get into that a lot more because I've experienced everything, all types of different traumatic events. But I have my own ways of dealing with those things, and some officers may not have that support system, or they just don't realize it, or they're still with that old mindset of hiding it away, just pushing it back. And we can talk about so many different issues with that because alcohol, right? We get into that. Substance abuse gets into that. But the chief and I, we're in position of leadership now. But back when I was an officer, it was important for me to recognize that, okay, in this line of work, I'm going to see things that most people won't. And how do we deal with that trauma? And Dr. Dardeen, you weren't really around when I was brand new on the streets.
Nope.
But my support system was really my wife. Like, I would share a lot, talk a lot about the stuff that I'm dealing with. But there's still stuff that I don't share with her, even to shield her from some of the things, right? So there is a place where it's like, okay, well, I can't talk to my wife because I don't want her to know about this stuff. So where do I go? And that's where it's important when you get in position of leadership to be really open about taking care of our officers and tell them that, hey, we have this traumatic event. If you don't have a system in place, we have that for you. And that's Dr. Dardeen. You don't even have to tell us that you go there. And I think the chief did a real good job of setting that standard. If you want to talk about a little bit about our debriefs.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, so good segue. And that, can you talk about, we call them emotional debriefs. I don't know what you call them, but so when we have a major incident that happens to kids, usually revolves around death. We've had, I don't want to bring those situations up, but we've had them, and I can remember those. And even watching the videos of those incidents are traumatic. So can you talk about what you do when an incident happens with a shift, an emotional debrief?
Yeah, so what we do is typically, it's loosely modeled after critical incident stress debriefs, and they have sort of a back and forth history, right? Sometimes people love them, sometimes they hate them. But the reality is, every time you're in a situation where your brain experiences something that's traumatic, and we don't get to decide when something's traumatic or not. Our brain does it for us. It's a protective mechanism. It's automatic, so we don't have control over that. But it happens in predictable ways. So you're going to react similarly whether you're in a car accident or you're an officer responding to a fatal car accident or things like that. So even if you're not a threat, your brain sometimes is going to behave as if it is. And then it's going to do predictable things. One of those things is during fight or flight, your brain is not as active and able to think rationally. It cuts off how we think so that our reaction times are faster. The difficulty in that is when the trauma is over, then our brain comes back to full capacity, right? Our heart rate goes down, all of those stress chemicals are draining out. Now our brain is more active, and now we are using our 100% brain capacity to judge our performance when we had 10% of brain capacity. So that's a problem, because now we can see all the angles and all the things we could have done, which then shows up as, well, why didn't I think of this in that moment? Or if I had done this, this would have been different. Or if I just hadn't done this one action, this bad thing wouldn't have happened, right? And that is especially exacerbated when we're talking about really emotional events, such as childhood deaths and things like that. So when our officers witness something that is so far outside of the norm, everybody is going to have a reaction to that. Some sort of reaction. Now, the hard part, and what Sean alluded to, is not every officer is going to react the same. So we can't put a hard and fast rule in of, well, if this happens, this is the result, right? Or this is the support, because it is so individualized. So one of the things that we do on larger events that do involve children is we systematically come together and have a post-incident, critical incident debrief. And that is focused on, one, education, helping them understand what your brain's going through, how it's going to react, but then also digging out those thoughts that are problematic. Because it's not the physical things that usually get us in trouble years down the road, it's the emotional and cognitive things. You can have those types of thoughts circling about an event for years and years after if they're not addressed. But if we can dig them out and immediately, give them skills immediately to start challenging those beliefs. They're not accurate beliefs anyway, but they're going to feel accurate because that's what your brain tells you, so you assume it's the truth. And so we're acting on those and believing that those things are accurate when they're not. So if we can bring the group together, show them that there are patterns that everybody falls into, they start to learn, wait, it's not me. I'm not broken. There's nothing wrong with me. Everybody's feeling this way, and here's how we combat it. So we lay out those strategies and give them a skill set that they can use to start confronting that immediately so it doesn't take hold. Because think about how powerful a thought would be if you believed it for 5 years before it's confronted. Like, you singularly leave a terrible scene believing something you could have done would have changed the outcome or prevented a terrible outcome, and nobody tells you differently. And after 5 years, it's absolute fact. Whereas if we pull that out right away and say, hey, that might feel true, but did you think about it from this perspective? And all of a sudden that thought is released, and it's not something that's plaguing them for the next 5 years. So that's the purpose behind those, and to help them understand that everybody responds this way after trauma. It's not anything anybody has done wrong. It makes the team stronger, because if there are things that they have questions about, we can vet those in a room together. Because another piece that comes into play when it comes to fight or flight responses is what's called auditory exclusion. If I'm hyper-focused on an event and my role in the event, I don't know where everybody else is or what happened. So then I only have pieces, and the pieces don't often make sense. So bringing everybody together and going through those pieces together helps fill in the gaps, and for a lot of folks, that's what they need to be able to move on.
And we include our dispatchers in that, or firefighters, so anybody that's involved in that, you help with that, bring them together in a room, and a roll call room, and
yeah,
how's
so
that
typically
work?
the only really thing that we exclude is, like, if we have a really large-scale incident, we're going to debrief by job description. So a dispatcher's role is quite different than a police officer's role. A firefighter's role and objectives during a trauma are very, very different than a police officer's. So there are some rural counties where people have lots of overlapping roles, so we might debrief that whole group together, but oftentimes when it comes to bigger events within the city, we're going to separate that out. So the officers will be debriefed together. Sometimes dispatchers are included in that, especially if there's just like one main dispatcher that was doing that. And then otherwise, we're going to do like fire a little bit separately in their group, because they're going to have a different focus. EMS, oftentimes, because a lot of fire departments are also trained to do medical runs, those can be debriefed together, but there are some general guidelines that we follow in not mixing some of those. But again, it depends on the situation. There are times when we need to, and especially like within a department, like your guys' is a much bigger department, so oftentimes we'll have detectives and coroner staff in with the officers and things like that, because again, they sometimes have pieces that are very helpful for folks that don't have the whole story to understand.
Chief, do you mandate all of the officers go to these debriefs, or is it voluntary?
Yeah, so whenever we have the emotional debriefs, it's mandatory that the entire shift gets together. Now, we don't mandate that people go see Dr. Dardeen, but we highly encourage it. It's a contract thing, to be quite honest with you. It's not in our contract that we mandate that people do that, but we encourage it highly. One question I did have, and it's along those lines, and Sean alluded to it, is something I always refer to when I do talks about policing as gallows humor. Yeah, you're in the middle of that hard scene, especially for me, it was dead body scenes. I mean, I remember going to my first dead body scene. It was gruesome. I don't want to describe it here, but it was shocking to me that somebody died in that way. And over time, when you're sitting there waiting for the coroner and doing the investigation, people start making jokes and this kind of thing. And it's not because we're cruel or being funny, but can you describe what gallows humor is in a more scientific way?
Yeah, I mean, simply to boil it down, it's just a coping skill, right? It to be able to find humor in a situation that is so difficult is your body's protective mechanism. So it's trying to make light of something, and it's trying to bring in a humorous way to see it, so that the horrors are not getting to you as much, right? So it's just a simple way to get a little bit of distance. Now, obviously, with the era of body cameras and things like that, that can be really misconstrued, and we always try to teach our folks, like, humor in itself is protective. It's actually good for you, but also know your audience. Like, try to make sure that if you are needing that escape, you're needing that space or whatever, take a step out and take care of yourself in that way. But yeah, it's very natural. It's a protective mechanism. We actually don't want to discourage it because it is a healthy thing. We just maybe need to educate people more that this is not a disrespect thing in any way, shape, or form. It's simply that first responder trying to protect themselves. Because you're right. I, as a civilian, might have 3 or 4 traumas in my lifetime. That would be on the high end for most people. Your officers might have a shift where they have 10 or 15 in a shift or two. Like, there can be those waves where they're really getting inundated. And so, yeah, sometimes all they can do is laugh about some of the things that they've seen, even though they're horrific things to see.
And a lot of times those conversations are not even about the scene that you're at,
Right.
Officers are just talking about what they did at lunch or dinner
Yeah.
or something. And it's just like a casual conversation, because at the end of the day, our job is still continuing. It doesn't just stop right there. We still, after we're done with that scene, on to the next one. And the next one might be,
Might be worse.
yeah, it might be worse, or it might be something funny, or it might be helping a child cross the road. I mean, who knows what's coming next? So it's like you just have to keep jumping those, the mind game, it just keeps going.
Sean brought up a good point, because the officer's job is just, it's so random. You may go to a dead body investigation. The next thing you're doing is a traffic stop. The next thing you're doing is helping a lady because her bank account got defrauded.
Right.
And it's hard to manage your emotions. Do you see that when you do your work with officers personally? Like, it's hard to manage that. Keep an even keel, and officers get up and excited, and maybe they're mean, and maybe they're not acting appropriately.
There are very few professions where you need as wide and depth of a skill set as you do for policing. Literally, they can go to, somebody who's called 911 15 times in the same day because they're hallucinating, or because they're, something's going on and they're not getting the answer that they want, and wearing those folks down. And then in the middle of that, an officer's responding to something where now their life is in danger, and you hear the stress in their voice on the radio. So there is lots of ebb and flow between things that are just mundane and irritating and that are hard to respond to, and then things that are truly dangerous and difficult. Not a lot of other jobs can claim that. So it is a huge role in just being complex.
And that's why you do our background investigations and do a psychological analysis of our officers before they are even hired. Can you explain a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so in Indiana, there are certain things that need to happen before folks enter certain professions, firefighting, policing, things like that. And one of the things that we know is that if you have somebody who has either certain personality characteristics certainly are not compatible with policing, but then also, we are primarily looking for underdiagnosed or undiagnosed mental health disorders, primarily schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Those are diagnoses that typically do not bode well in a stressful environment. So you can't put somebody with either the precursors for those or an active diagnosis of that in a first responder role and expect them to perform well. So we do what we can at the beginning to weed them out, to make sure that those are not folks we're putting in that position. One, to protect the person, because we know that they're not going to be able to be functional in that role, and potentially their quality of life could go way down. But then also to protect the departments, because how much does it cost to onboard a new officer? A lot,
it's a big
right?
risk.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of money. And if they are becoming ill quickly within a few months or a few years, even up to 5 years of being onto the department, that's not helpful. And that's, a community cost, because that's where your budgets come from and whatnot. So it's our job as psychologists to try to figure out, who's going to bode well in this type of environment. And there's certain factors that we're looking to see and certain ones that we're looking to avoid to maintain that.
Yeah. And then, like, kind of going off that, I'm going to loop back around to our debriefs that we're talking about. So I know the chief said, so we mandate our officers to come to these debriefs after a critical event. During those debriefs, we're in an open area. I've been part of one, and everyone is sitting there, and you're kind of leading the conversation. But we are in an open environment. Everyone's there. Everyone is sharing. Some people are more open to sharing information. Some aren't. So how do you react with officers in an open environment, and we're trying to talk about our feelings? Because if there's one thing that officers are not good with, is talking about their feelings in an open environment.
They don't like emotions. We say reactions a lot of times to avoid that conflict. So we never force anybody to participate. But the reason a debrief is structured the way it is that we come in from a factual basis in terms of, hey, I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. In order for me to give you the best information to help you recover, if that's what we need in this moment, I need to know what happened. So we kind of invite them, just share your role. Tell me where you were. That's pretty low risk, right? That's a low risk share. We're not jumping into, tell me how you feel about all these things right off the bat. In fact, you'll very rarely hear me use the word feelings in a debrief. Then we move into some education, right? Because I cannot expect you to share something that makes you vulnerable, as in, how did this impact you? What are you questioning? If I haven't told you that questioning is normal. So then I move into some teaching in terms of, hey, here's what your brain does when it's exposed to a traumatic event. Here's how it reacts. Here's the common things that everybody feels. Also, what are we noticing? And then we'll go around and have everybody usually share if they're comfortable. And again, if not, they just wave us off. We go to the next person. Don't make a big deal out of it. However, I say most of the time, I can only think of one or two times when somebody has chosen not to participate, and usually by the end, they're participating.
Yeah.
So once they realize that the risk is not too great and that the purpose is just to create that safety and to process that event, they usually jump in. In fact, I had to laugh one time, it was probably 4 or 5 years ago now, that I was at a fire department and they'd had a fatal fire, and the one of the guys, they'd warned me ahead, like, so-and-so will be here, but he probably won't participate. And I was like, that's fine. Let him do what he's comfortable with. Well, he started out hanging out, 25 feet away literally at the door, like hanging in the door. And then as it went on, he got closer and closer. And then eventually he pulled up a chair, and then eventually he's talking sharing his experience and everything. So, that's our goal, is to make people as comfortable as possible, normalize the fact that it's okay to have a reaction, or it's okay to not have one this time, but know that other people might be, and here's how we can process that. So we just kind of meet them where they're at and give them the space to do that.
And I think from our standpoint, like from a leadership standpoint, we find it very important, because even if an officer's in there and they don't speak,
right,
you still leave there with your card.
Yeah.
And that officer could be like, you know what? This conversation opened something up for me. Now they can reach out to you privately and still come and talk to you. And I think that's super important. I know for a fact we have saved careers doing that. We have saved them in their personal life doing that. Yeah. And that's how we take care of our people. And I think that's super, super important.
And I love that they see the older officers being just as impacted, because oftentimes the younger officers are afraid, right, to show any emotion or reaction. And these older guys, they certainly didn't feel anything. And now if I am, that's something. So, anytime we have the opportunity to have experienced command staff, again, the rules usually you have to have been on scene and been in, participatory in this event, then, we ask them to also share. And I think that brings down a lot of walls.
Yeah. When it comes down to just mental health in general, for first responders, a new thing I learned is I didn't know you yourself was a first responder in the past. So that already puts you ahead. Like, you already know some of the things that we're experiencing and things we should be doing to take care of our mental health for the long run. Any advice you can give our listeners what they should be doing, practicing, things to kind of just find important?
Absolutely. I think you have to have a foundation. You have to have, if all you have is your job, right? We want to be good workers. We want to give our all that good stuff applies. But if all you have is your job and you don't have things to look forward to in your life outside of your job, you're going to struggle. Not initially, right? Because it's exciting, it's new, there's so much to learn. It's a very steep learning curve, right? Officers don't usually feel confident and comfortable and competent until they've been there 2 or 3 years, really. But after that point, If you don't have some things outside of the department to do, good relationships in your life, hobbies that you enjoy, things that give meaning to your life, you are going to struggle. And if you train yourself only to use repression and not feel anything, the reality is that strategy will work for a little bit of time, but over time, it will get harder and harder, and eventually it will stop working. So the way to avoid that is to start early, get comfortable, find your people that you can talk to, make sure you have things outside of work, because then if you have a bad day at work, it's not a bad life. It's just a bad day at work. And you can go home and distract yourself and get involved with other things. But if that's all you have, and then you go through a period of time where things are rough, how are you going to be feeling? Right? Our brains are not designed to make us happy. Our brains are designed to keep us alive. Period. End of story. That's its job. And so if we are not putting things into our life, experiences, people, meaning, we are not going to enjoy our experience.
That's fantastic. And I remember, that's probably 2004, 2003 maybe. It was a captain who I think was ahead of his time, said something like that. We were doing FTO training, FTO schools here, and that's field training for the listeners, and talked about that. And there were some arguments in the room about, no, I care about my job only. There was a back and forth. I remember that distinctly. You don't remember many things long going to occur, but I remember that, and I took that to heart.
Yeah.
And so that's why physical fitness training for a lot of us is the thing, or any of these, even like video games, stuff like that, just to get you out of this realm is critical for a long-term career, healthy life, I think. That is really good stuff you just said there. I appreciate that.
Thank you. You got to have that balance, and I think that's hard because when you're young, you want to be recognized, right, as being a hardworking officer. You want to be seen as being there when needed. You want to be part of the team, and you almost over-identify those first few years to get that. I think that's normal. I think we're going to see that. But if our folks who are in field training and our folks who are, established officers can remind them early and often, hey, get some balance in your life, get some things going on that are positive, I think you'll see them do a lot better.
And what advice do you have for the families at home? Like Sean, you mentioned you would talk to your wife about your day. Are there any signs of stress that families can recognize?
Absolutely. Irritability is probably the easiest one that people are going to pick up on first. So sleep disruption, irritability, shifts in mood and energy level. You have to think about the fact that we do a lot of ride-alongs, which I'm really overdue for, so I'm going to be hitting you up for that. That's how we learn and stay connected to you all. And so the reality is when we go on a ride-along, I learn just how bad I would be as a police officer. I do not have those skills. I'm not going to pretend that I have those skills. But the reality is it's such a finely honed skill set that it's so normal for you. You don't even know what it is. And so you're coming home and having to transition from work me, where I control everything, I authoritatively describe, demand, whatever, direct things going on in my life, and I problem solve. That's my job. And then I come home and I do a couple different things. Most of the time, what we hear on our end of things is I come home, I fall into the couch, I don't want to make any more decisions, I'm exhausted and overtired from my day, and then I spend hours scrolling on my phone and or ignoring my family and or watching TV. And that takes a huge toll on spouses. And being able to talk to your spouse and share some of that is phenomenal. You don't have to share every nitty-gritty detail, but having some level, because I think the other half of that is I don't want to expose them to this terrible underbelly of the things that go on in the world, so I'm not going to tell them. Well, then as that police career continues, the space between people gets bigger and bigger because the officer says she doesn't understand me or he doesn't understand me, and of course that's true because you haven't let them. You've not shared anything because you're trying to protect them, but then you're building a wall. And also your spouse is not your suspect, so you can't come home and interrogate them about their day and or direct their behaviors.
Yeah, it's hard because kids will tell fibs, and you'll just know that that's not the truth. So you got to not.
It's a skill set that you have that you have to be able to have a transition piece. Like, what's my intention as I'm going to work this day, and now what's my intention as I'm transitioning to home me? But that is a really hard skill set to adjust. And then it causes a lot of distress in the home life. And we see higher rates of divorce and alcoholism and things like that because of that. So, figuring out what level of communication you can have reasonably with your spouse, and then listening if they say, hey, you're not you. When they see a change, you think you're protecting them and you're keeping it all inside. Guess what? You're not, and they can see it. And if they say, hey, you're not you, I'm worried, or a friend says that to you, like, try not to be defensive about it and try to take that to heart and go, maybe they're seeing something I don't, and be proactive about that.
Yeah. Yeah. What about physical fitness, like just health and wellness with nutrition? I worked nights for a long time, so that was really hard. I'm not nearly as fit as the chief, but my goal is to get there. So I know physical fitness for me is huge.
Yeah.
Like I always start my day with some kind of a workout, and I always tell my wife that if I don't work out, I'm gonna have a bad day.
Right.
Yeah,
And it's almost
you got to do it early in the morning.
I guess the first thing. That's how I start
Make
my
sure
day.
it gets done. Yeah. No, you'll never hear me say that exercise is bad. However, exercise shouldn't be your only thing, right? Use that as one of those things. It helps build your sleep drive, so it's going to help you sleep better. It helps smooth your mood and mellow your emotions so that you have better control. It helps ease anxiety. Obviously, it's a skill set you need in your job anyway for your safety. Right. Like, there's a ton of different things that are there. If you stay focused on the things you can control, you're going to feel better. So what you put in your body matters. Trying to have as healthy a diet as you can. You know, bring stuff with you to work. Try to pre-plan, especially if you are a night shifter, because the healthy things aren't open late, right? So you have to plan around that a little bit. But even daytime, right? Sometimes it gets so busy you can't stop. So making sure you have appropriate fuel, good types of like fast energy power bar type things that you have, so that you're not going too long between meals, so that you're getting these big blood sugar swings. Stay hydrated. I know that this might be too much to disclose on a podcast, but for those of us that are women that have already had a few children, we have to be very careful about how much water we drink, because we can't always, feasibly get to a restroom quickly. But that's important. Stay hydrated, like take control of those types of things. Make sure you're trying to arrange your environment so you have enough time for sleep and you're putting effort into that. Don't get trapped in a ride-along when you've drank a whole bottle of water, where you can't feasibly get out of there quickly, right? Our officers have limitations when it comes to where is it even safe and convenient for them to stop and use the restroom. Like, they have to think about things that we don't. And so how do we prepare for that and work that into our day?
And I think all that advice really goes for not just first responders, but pretty much anyone. Yeah. Like, get your sleep, be a healthy person.
Right. Control the variables you can control.
Don't drink as many energy drinks as we do.
No energy drinks.
I knew that would get you going.
No. Please decrease the energy drinks. Like, I understand if you're a night guy, you got to have some caffeine to get through. But, like, yes, look at what's in those things and find safer alternatives.
Well, Chief, you got anything else for Dr. Dardeen?
No, but I do want to again thank her for what she's done for our community, our police department. This podcast just kind of displays the value that you have for what we do here.
Yeah,
so we're proud of it. We're proud of our relationship.
I appreciate it. Yeah. I will say just one thing that I try to remind the guys regularly, because they ask me to do this as regularly as possible, is that if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, right? And the reality is we have surpassed, almost every department we serve, we have surpassed 50% rate of people coming in.
And I love that.
People are coming in. They are coming in. They are getting care. They are doing what they need to do. So don't let anybody fool you when they say, we don't need that. We're tough. Well, yeah, you're tough because you're taking care of yourself. Right? You're tough because you're getting in there and addressing things and not letting them linger.
And it's private, because when you say over 50%, I don't know anybody that's going to see you.
Right.
So good on them for doing it, and good on you for being private about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think to close things off, I think my message for everyone would be that here, though this is just another podcast, a prime example of the resources that we provide to our Lafayette officers and other first responders within our city. But if anyone is having anything, they can check you out at Suncrest, right?
Absolutely. Yep. It's www.suncrestpsychologicalservices.com. So kind of a long name. Sorry about that, but that's how it goes. But yeah, they can always call and reach out. Not only are we just a private business, we're also a 501c3, which means we hold funding for any first responder in the agency. We've gotten a lot of donations over the past year from like county Walmarts in various areas. So even if your agency doesn't have a contract, doesn't have support, we have funding to take care of first responders, and then we will continue to do so.
Awesome. Well, we take care of our people, so all of our listeners, go take care of yourselves. So
Yep.
with that, we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Got that.